The fluorescent lights in the Sterling Heights boardroom hummed with a clinical frequency that matched the stillness in my chest. I adjusted my notepad, positioning myself in the corner chair, the one nobody ever wanted, because it faced away from the windows. It was perfect for someone who was supposed to be invisible. Natalie Coffey. My stepmother, Tiffany, snapped her fingers without looking at me. She barked for me to make sure it was actually hot this time, unlike yesterday's disaster. I stood quietly, smoothing down my archival knit sweater. It was gray and faded, a relic from a time before Tiffany had systematically erased my mother's presence from this building. At 28, I had perfected the art of being the family disappointment. I'm sitting here with a quiet coffee, watching the world go by. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories. Moments like this make me realize how much strength is often hidden in the shadows. Where are you watching from, and what's your favorite drink right now? I look forward to your comments. But back in that boardroom, the air was cold. Michael stood at the head of the mahogany table, his posture radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of occupying spaces built by someone else. He adjusted his silk tie, an expensive piece of armor meant to signal a power he was currently trying to liquidate. I returned with the coffee, placing the cup in front of Tiffany with the clinical precision of a lab technician. She did not acknowledge me. She did not even look up from her tablet, where she was already browsing floor plans for a Manhattan penthouse that cost more than the retirement funds of 50 of our employees. My father cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. He announced that the Aegis Group had offered $680 million for a total acquisition of Sterling Heights hospitality. To him, this was not the sale of a century-old legacy. It was a transaction to turn history into liquid cash. He spoke about the company like it was a family piggy bank he had finally decided to smash open. Dylan lounged in the seat to my father's right, his heavy gold watch catching the overhead light. He was already calculating the cost of a private jet, laughing about how he would never have to step foot in a commercial airport again. Brooke sat beside him, smoothing her designer blazer and mocking my presence with a single, sharp look. She whispered to Tiffany that they should finally hire a real archivist once the sale was complete, as if my 12 years of preserving this company's soul had been nothing but a hobby for the help. Michael began listing the shareholder votes as a mere formality. He calculated 64% approval, assuming he held the proxy control over the retired employee block and his minor allies. He believed the remaining shares were scattered and inactive, leaving him with a comfortable majority to force the sale. When my name finally came up, it was an afterthought. He noted my 4% stake, with a dismissive wave telling the room that my portion was just enough to buy a few luxury dinners and perhaps a new wardrobe that did not come from a clearance rack. I watched him strike my name from the list of relevant voices with a cold, black ink. He told me that while I had a sentimental attachment to Grandpa Thomas's hotels, this was a world of business I did not understand. He did not realize that while they were looking at yachts, I was looking at the ledger. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long, footing the emotional bill while they overdrafted my compassion. I did not correct him. I simply opened my notepad and recorded the exact moment they decided the legacy was for sale. This was not a family meeting anymore. It was an accounting. The vote was a mere formality, or so they thought. Michael called for all in favor of the acquisition. Shouts of aye rippled across the table. Tiffany, Dylan, Brooke, and the uncles all spoke with the synchronized greed of a choir. Michael turned his gaze toward me, his eyes devoid of any actual interest. Natalie, for the record, how do you vote your 4%? Against. I said it quietly, without looking up from my notepad. The room erupted, not in anger, but in laughter. It was a high-pitched, mocking sound that filled the boardroom like static. Dylan leaned back, a sneer tugging at his mouth. Against? You are voting against $27 million? I guess you really do want to stay in that basement forever. Brooke tapped her manicured nails on the table. She thinks she is making a stand. It is adorable, really like a child refusing to go to bed, while the adults are deciding the future of the estate. Michael sighed, making a notation on his papers. Your objection is noted, Natalie, and overruled. The vote carries 64% to 4%. The motion passes. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I let their amusement wash over me because they did not understand the nature of my silence. People often ask why the quiet ones stay for so long, why they endure the snapping fingers, the cold coffee, and the constant reminders that they are less than. They call it weakness, but they do not see the invisible chain of the survivor. For 12 years, I had occupied a prison without bars. I had been conditioned into a state of learned helplessness, a psychological house of glass, where my only safety was in being invisible. But I had turned that silence into a strategic weapon. I was not just sitting there taking their abuse. I was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the clock to run out, while they were too arrogant to look at the person holding the ledger. My mind drifted to the day I finished my degree at Stanford. The family narrative was that I had failed or hidden away, but in reality, I had spent every summer and holiday for 12 years in these archives, returning full-time the moment Grandpa Thomas fell ill. I wasn't hiding, I was apprenticing, under the only man who knew the truth. In reality, I was in a hospital room, holding Grandpa Thomas's hand. He knew Michael was a competent manager, but a catastrophic steward. He told me that the moment he died, the family would treat the legacy like a resource to be extracted, rather than a foundation to be built. He needed someone who loved the bedrock, not just the penthouse. So I spent 12 years in the basement archives. While Brooke was posing for magazines and Dylan was crashing expensive cars, I was conducting a decade-long forensic audit. I studied every successful transition in the industry. I knew the flow of every dollar in this company. I understood the founding charter better than the man who currently held the title of CEO. I was the keeper of the soul of Sterling Heights, and Grandpa Thomas had made sure that when I turned 28, I would have the power to protect it. I looked at my father as he reached for the champagne. He thought he was closing a deal. I knew he was opening a tomb. Tiffany's face contorted, her polished exterior fracturing into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. You ungrateful little brat, she hissed, her voice trembling with the weight of a Manhattan penthouse that was suddenly slipping through her fingers. She accused me of sabotaging the family's happiness out of spite, as if my dissenting vote was a personal attack rather than a legal right. Brooke joined in, her voice high and frantic, claiming I was trying to ruin their glorious future just because I was bitter about my own pathetic life. I did not answer a single one of them. I went back to my notepad, my pen moving in steady, clinical strokes. Anger was not loud this time. It was an accounting entry. I watched my father slam his hand onto the table, the heavy mahogany vibrating under the force of his desperation. Natalie, this is not a game, he barked, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. The truth finally clawed its way out of him. He admitted that he did not just want this sale. He needed it. Last year, he had secretly taken out a bridge loan against the company's core assets, a loan totaling $85 million. He had dumped the cash into an expansion into South American markets that was currently hemorrhaging money at a rate I had already calculated to the cent. He had kept the debt hidden behind a complex web of off-balance sheet shell companies, banking on the Aegis Group money to fill the hole before any external auditor could link the liabilities back to our primary ledger. To the world, the foundation looked solid. Only the basement archives held the proof of the rot. Dylan's smirk had vanished, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man realizing his yacht was made of paper. Brooke looked like she was about to hyperventilate. They were not shocked by what Michael had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. My father leaned over the table, his eyes wide and pleading. If we do not close this deal today, the bank calls that $85 million due in full, he whispered. The company will go into receivership. Your precious 4% will be worth zero. We will all be on the street. I looked at him, then really looked at him. I saw a man who mistook status for achievement and treated a legacy as a resource to be extracted. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and today I was closing the account. Tiffany stepped toward my corner chair, her finger pointed at my chest. She threatened that if I did not change my vote immediately, she would have me evicted from my apartment and erased from the family history by morning. She called me a sentimental fool who did not understand that people like me were only kept around for the sake of appearances. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This was not a family drama. It was a balance sheet, and they were in the red. Michael checked his watch, the same one that was now a countdown to his financial execution. He told the room we had less than 30 minutes before the Aegis team arrived to sign the papers. He demanded a final answer. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 1:51 p.m. I knew that in exactly 9 minutes, the world they had built on my silence would begin to burn. I stood up slowly, gathering my notes. I have heard enough, I said softly. I walked toward the door, leaving them to their panic. Inside, my notepad glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. James Wellington, the CEO of Aegis Group, walked in, flanked by a phalanx of attorneys, whose briefcases cost more than the cars our hotel managers drive. Michael stood to greet him, his hand outstretched, but his eyes were glued to the folder containing the signature page. He was a man drowning, and that $680 million document was his only life raft. James returned the greeting with the polished warmth of a predator ready to swallow our century of history for an undervalued bargain. Tiffany smoothed her hair, her eyes already distant, likely redecorating that imaginary Manhattan penthouse in her mind. Brooke and Dylan sat up straighter, looking like they were waiting for a coronation rather than a corporate liquidation. "Shall we proceed?" James's lead counsel asked, opening a leather-bound portfolio. Michael reached for his Mont Blanc pen, the one Grandpa Thomas had gifted him 30 years ago, as a reminder of stewardship. Michael's fingers were trembling as he prepared to sign away the very thing that pen represented. But before the nib could touch the paper, the lead counsel's tablet chimed. He frowned, scrolling through a new notification. "James, hold on. We have a non-compliance alert from the state registry." Michael's face went from a desperate crimson to a sickly, translucent gray. "It is an administrative error, surely," he stuttered, his voice cracking. James did not answer. He was looking at his lead attorney. "Sir," the lawyer said, his voice flat and clinical, "our final due diligence check just updated. Sterling Heights Hospitality has a controlling stakeholder with 82% ownership under an entity called Thomas Heritage Holdings. The 64% shareholder vote you conducted this morning is legally void. You do not have the authority to authorize this sale." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Tiffany laughed, but the sound was brittle and high-pitched. "Michael, tell them they are wrong. Your father died 12 years ago. He left the shares distributed. There is no majority holder." My father did not answer. He looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. Just then, the door opened again. Margaret Chin walked in. She was the most formidable corporate attorney in Chicago, and she looked at my father like he was a minor clerical error. "James, I am Margaret Chin," she said, her heels clicking on the marble floor with lethal precision. "I represent Thomas Heritage Holdings. We are the 82% stakeholder, and we officially decline the sale to Aegis Group." Michael stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "My father's will was clear. Everything was distributed. Who controls this company? Grandpa Thomas spent 20 years quietly buying back shares from retiring employees and small investors," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "He consolidated 82% of the company and transferred it all to the holdings company 2 weeks before he died. He knew you were a manager, Dad, not a builder. He knew you would try to sell the bedrock for the sake of a paycheck." But it was not just a sale. Margaret opened a second folder, sliding a document across the table toward the Aegis team. James, your due diligence team was misled. Michael provided you with a 2010 restated charter that conveniently omitted the preservation clauses, claiming the 1954 original was lost in a fire. He was secretly negotiating a side letter to liquidate these heritage hotels into luxury condos, betting that the original prohibition against demolition would never surface. This was not just an acquisition, it was a fraud built on a lie. It would have legally triggered a clause to erase the founding charter, the one that lists Natalie's biological mother as the primary visionary and co-founder of this empire. Michael was planning to strike her name from history to satisfy your development requirements. I watched my father. He did not deny it. He had been willing to bulldoze my mother's memory to pay for Dylan's yacht and Tiffany's lifestyle. This was not a business deal. It was a desecration. But the trust Grandpa Thomas built was ironclad. It vested on my 28th birthday 3 months ago. I've spent the last 90 days watching you divide a carcass that has not even stopped breathing yet. I looked at James Wellington. I am the sole member and managing director of Thomas Heritage Holdings. I own 82% of this company. I own this room, and this transaction is dead. I stood up slowly, the corner chair no longer my anchor, and walked to the head of the table where Michael was still frozen in shock. I did not wait for a seat to be offered. I took the one that had been held by a ghost for 12 years. With a steady hand, I connected my phone to the massive boardroom display, and the screen flickered to life, revealing the true internal anatomy of Sterling Heights. The room was silent enough to hear the rapid, shallow breathing of people who had just realized their rented power was expiring. I did not look at them with anger. I looked at them with the cold precision of an auditor. This was not a family drama anymore. It was a balance sheet, and their accounts were about to be closed. Dylan, I said, looking at my half-brother whose gold watch now looked like a heavy shackle. Effective immediately, you are removed as head of business development. My forensic audit of the South American expansion shows a loss of $18 million in just 8 months, a division you personally structured to hide personal expenses. Brooke, the marketing budget is being cut by 40%, and your position is terminated. We are refocusing on actual return on investment metrics, rather than your vanity campaigns. I turned my gaze to Tiffany. She was gripping the table so hard her knuckles were white. Tiffany, your consulting fee of $15,000 per month is terminated. You have attended 4 meetings in 2 years and contributed nothing beyond your preferences for expensive champagne. Your access to the corporate accounts and the company properties ends tonight. The collapse was almost physical. Michael sank into his chair, his commanding presence evaporating like a mist. It was a perfect demonstration of the illusion of power, held by an empty wallet. Their entire sense of self had been a luxury they could not afford, a facade rented with the legacy of a man they never respected. When the money vanished, they were revealed for what they truly were, people with no internal value to stand on once the external wealth was stripped away. Michael's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. Natalie, please. That $85 million bridge loan is due in 30 days. If you do not authorize this sale, the bank will take everything. I am not selling, Michael, I said, using his name for the first time in my life. I am authorizing an emergency capital injection from our reserve capital to cover the debt. We will maintain operational funding, but the days of treating this company as a family piggy bank are over. They were not shocked by my cruelty. They were shocked that I had stopped playing the role of the silent disappointment they had written for me. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and now the subscription was canceled. I was no longer the invisible girl in the corner chair. I was the executive chairperson of the legacy they had tried to burn. I did not wait for a response as I gathered my things and walked out of the boardroom. I did not ask for permission to enter the office at the end of the hall, the one that had been locked since Grandpa Thomas died 12 years ago. I had the key. I had always had the key. Inside, the room was preserved like a museum smelling of old leather and the faint, lingering scent of my mother's favorite perfume. I sat in the high-back chair, looking out over the Chicago skyline, and felt the weight of responsibility finally settling onto my shoulders. Michael knocked on the door at 7 p.m. He looked older than he had that morning, the unearned confidence stripped away to reveal a man who was terrified of his own shadow. He sat slowly in the chair across from my desk, looking around the room as if he were seeing it for the first time. I did not offer him a drink. I did not offer him a way out. I placed a single document on the mahogany desk. It was an irrevocable resignation and a total waiver of all operational authority. In exchange for his signature, I told him I would authorize a distribution from my personal dividends to cover the $85 million debt he had secretly guaranteed with his own shares. I was buying his freedom, with the money he had tried to steal from me. "You really knew everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. He asked why I had stayed quiet for 12 years. I told him Grandpa Thomas wanted me to earn my place, not inherit it. He wanted me to understand the company from the basement up, and he wanted me to see who they all really were when they thought I did not matter. Michael flinched. I told him I was not trying to hurt him, but he was always planning an exit strategy. He saw the company as a retirement fund. I saw it as the livelihoods of our employees. He signed the paper with a shaky hand. For the first time in my life, I saw him look at me not with dismissal, but with fear. He had almost sold the soul of this family for a lowball offer, banking on his own financial ignorance. As he stood to leave, I informed him that tomorrow is Monday, a fresh start. I announced that I was raising the wages for every member of the staff and designating 3 of our landmark hotels as permanent heritage sites. Michael walked out of the office, a defeated man, leaving behind the title he loved for the paycheck he craved. I looked at the manufacturing and service reports on my desk. 347 families were counting on me. I opened my laptop and got to work. The lights of the city glowed outside the window, and for the first time in 12 years, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt like a steward. Grandpa Thomas had been right. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time was today. The envelope on the desk was yellowed at the edges, a small, physical piece of the past that had been waiting 12 years for this moment. I broke the wax seal with fingers that were finally steady. Grandpa Thomas's handwriting was elegant and firm, a reflection of the man who had understood the value of bedrock. He wrote that he knew my father was a good manager, but one who mistook status for achievement. He knew Tiffany and my siblings saw Sterling Heights as a resource to extract rather than a legacy to build. He told me the shares were mine, not because of my blood, but because I was the only one who saw the company as a living thing that needed tending, not a commodity to be traded. As I sat there, his words felt like a warm hand on my shoulder, a final validation of the 12 years I had spent in the shadows. I have come to realize that for so long, I was waiting for them to give me permission to exist. I was waiting for a seat at a table that was never intended for me. But true power does not come from an invitation. It comes from the strength you build when nobody is watching. I want to speak directly to those of you who are listening and feel like the invisible one in your own story. Maybe you are the one who stays quiet to keep the peace, the one who does the work while others take the credit, or the one whose value is only acknowledged when there is a crisis to be fixed. If you find yourself in that corner chair, remember this. Your worth is not a balance sheet that others get to audit. The people who try to make you feel small are often just terrified of how big you truly are. Forgiveness is a luxury you can choose to give yourself, but it does not require you to walk back into a burning house. I used to think my silence was a sign of my weakness, but I realize now it was my preparation. I was building a foundation while they were just decorating the penthouse. Do not be afraid to set a boundary that feels like a wall, because sometimes that wall is the only thing protecting your soul. Your value is internal. It is forged in the dark, in the archives, and in the quiet moments when you choose to keep going even when you are not seen. One day, the lights will turn on, and you will not just have a seat at the table, you will own the room. If this story reminded you that your value is internal, hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to know they are enough. Subscribe for more stories of justice. I will see you in the next one.